Well, hello YouTube. This is Odie Coyote here. I'm going to do a video tutorial today on how to hand sew faux fur. Specifically, I'd like to do a tutorial on how to sew into your bodysuit patches, spots, or marks. Now, I haven't seen any video tutorials on how to do this, so I figured I would take a shot and see how we do. I'm going to add some annotations in. Feel free to click on them. They should be kind of the hot spots and highlights of this video. But I hope you watch the whole thing and leave some comments for me. Let me know how I did. Alright, before we get started, let's talk about some of the tools we might need to use to do this project. I have some scissors here. I have a small set. I use these for cutting thread or for getting into narrow places. It's just a good idea to have something like that. I also have some sharp, nice flat shears. I only use these for fabric, so I try to keep them clean and sharp that way. And I also have a utility knife. Now there's a couple different styles that people like to cut fur with, so it really just depends on how you want to do it. This is the style utility knife that I use. It's just a flat razor. I don't use it very much. I tend to use scissors. I'm just a little bit more careful that way. I also use some general utility scissors, just in case I need to cut something a little bit thicker. You want to use some markers, maybe a couple different colors of thread. I've got some pins. I use straight pins, and I also use safety pins. It just depends on the project and where you're at. Another good tool to use would be a thread cutter. If you're sewing anything at all, really, you want to use something like that. Let's move on to our pattern. I've got a pattern here for a paw print because that's the marking that I'm going to be sewing into this bodysuit. Now I just cut this out with normal construction paper, or thick cardboard, whatever works for you. Now this is the size that I actually want it to be, and I will draw outlines around the pattern in order to leave room for the stitching. So when I trace this on the fabric, I will leave about 1/4 of an inch, and that's my seam allowance. And I draw about 1/4 of an inch further out for that, and that's where I actually cut the fabric for the pattern. Alright, so I'm going to show you now what it looks like on the fabric. Alright, so I forgot that we skipped ahead. This is actually what it looks like when it's finished. So this is what you should expect when we're done. Now it lays really flat. That is part of the goal of using this blanket stitch. It's a really strong stitch. It's not really going to go anywhere. So you're not really compromising the integrity of your bodysuit by putting a marking in it. Alright, so this is what our fabric looks like after it's been cut and pinned. Now if you set the pattern inside of it, you'll see that the inside line is it's the same size as the pattern. Now I drew a line about 1/4 of an inch out, and that's my seam allowance. And then I left another 1/4 of an inch just for sizing in case I made a mistake somewhere. Now you see this inner line here? This is actually where the pattern has been cut out on the bodysuit, and the stitching is going to come pretty close to it. In order to get that flat stitch, you want it to come together almost as if it's one piece of fabric. You don't really want it to have room to stretch. Alright, well, the next step now is to put a quick stitch in it just to hold it together. So let's turn it over and get started on that. Alright, now I'm using a red thread. It's just there so that I can easily see it when we need to remove the stitch later. Now, you're just kind of doing a zigzag kind of a stitch, going one side, coming out the other, and then we're going to tie it off at the end. It's really just a simple stitch, just to hold it so that you don't have to have pins on it anymore. Now, the key to remember here is you just need a nice tight stitch to hold this together. It doesn't have to be perfect because this kind of thread is going to get ripped out when we're done. Now, I know you don't want to sit here and watch me stitch the whole thing, so we're going to speed it up a little bit. Alright, so let's take a closer view of this. Once again, like I said, since I wanted to make it easier for me to see, I used a red thread. It doesn't really matter, it's whatever you want. It's just easier for me to see. Now, I haven't trimmed this fur yet, so this is just, it's kind of a rough cut. Alright, so we flipped the fur over, and we're going to kind of comb it out a little bit. It's important to make sure that you don't have any of your fibers of the different colors stick inside of your stitch, because when you cut it, you'll have fur that pulls out. Now, if you can notice, the fur has a direction. It goes from right to left on this, as the top is on my right and the bottom is at my left. So you want to push some of that fur out through the holes, and then you can use a comb to pull it through later. But the stitch will hold most of that fur outside. Now we're going to use a brush just to lightly pull out some of that fur so that it's not stuck in the stitches. Now if you look here, you can see that the two furs, they're close, but it doesn't really matter because it's a small spot. Now, you can see that the fur doesn't quite line up, so we're going to go ahead and trim that. Alright, in order to make this flush, we're going to trim it. And yes, I'm going to use scissors. Because I have the fur already pulled through the stitch, it's not really going to matter how we cut it. And yes, I am left-handed, so I guess in the furry sense you would call me a southpaw. Alright, so as we're cutting it, you want to pull some of that extra fiber out. Just don't want a lot of loose fibers in there when you're sewing. Just gets in your way and makes a mess. Sometimes I use a small scissor here just to trim the places that my shears can't really get to. Now, I already pulled the desired amount of fur through here, so I'm cutting the extra out. Some people might get a little nervous with this. Just take your time, and if you make a mistake, you might have to cut a new piece of fur out. Just be careful. As you can see here, I'm cutting along that seam allowance. So I have roughly, it's between an eighth of an inch and a quarter of an inch. That way I have a little bit of room to move. But when you stitch it together, it's going to be pretty close. Now I'm going ahead and I'm just trimming the extra fur out of there because it gets in the way when you're sewing. Alright, well, we're about ready to move on to that next step. Alright, so to sew this, I've decided to use a thread that will match the color, at least one half of the colors. It hides rather well. Now I'm using polyester thread. I don't believe in using upholstery thread. I think it's just too strong and it rips your fabric out. I'd much rather have the stitch break because you can fix that rather than your fabric breaking. Now, I apologize if it's a little hard to see some of this because of the colors. I might do another video with some other thread, but I put some reference videos in and the links down below. So if you need some help with how to do the blanket stitch, go ahead and take a look at that. Now when I sew this, I'm going to take about 18 to 36 inches, but since I'm doing a double thread with it, you want to double that. So the point is, when you use two threads, if one is to break in the stitch, the other one should still hold tight. Always have more thread so you don't have to tie off and start another one for the last like inch or so. Alright, so I'm going to tie a knot here at the end and we're going to get started with sewing. So we have a nice thick thread here. Since we're using two threads cut from the same roll, Alright, so I'm left-handed. Hopefully that doesn't mess with you too much, but to get started, I'm going to put the needle in between the two fabrics. and we're going to pull it through so that the knot comes in the middle, and then tie it tight. This will just lock the start of your stitch so that it's not going to unravel. Now this isn't exactly a tutorial on how to do the blanket stitch, but I placed a link where you can watch that, a nice good tutorial with different colored thread and fabric. But to do a simple blanket stitch, you're going to pull it through one direction the whole time and then loop it over. So we pulled it through from left to right, and we pulled the stitch to the right, and then we're going in from the right to the left now. And I pull it in with my finger to leave a little loop. And the key is to come back in that same direction that you pushed your needle through and pull it through that loop. Pulling it through this loop makes a little knot and leaves a little bit of thread on the top of your stitch. Pull it nice and tight, and then you just rinse and repeat. Now I move down probably about 1/8 of an inch each time I do the stitch. That keeps it nice and tight, especially in something this small. You want the fabric to be as if it was sewn together from the factory. And we're just going to pull another loop, get it snug, and time to fast forward. Alright, now that we've come full circle on this print, on this mark, we're going to pull into the last spot and tie a knot in itself so that the stitch won't come undone. Alright, now I leave a little bit of thread there when I cut so that if it were to come a little loose, it wouldn't unravel right at the knot. But that's your simple stitch, and we're going to need to cut out the old red thread because it's not really needed now. Alright, well, I didn't want to make you sit there and watch me pull the thread out, so I've done some of it myself and skipped it. But alright, that is what it looks like. On the inside of the bodysuit, let's turn it out real quick and show you what it looks like, how everyone else will see it. Alright, so this is a little bit better of a view. I figured it might just be a nice angle for you to see doing a larger mark. Now, I hope it looks a little bit more like a paw print to you than it did earlier. I've got everything trimmed and I'm starting the sewing, but I'm going to go ahead and speed it up so you can kind of just pay attention as you want and not watch about a half an hour worth of me stitching. The key is just to rinse and repeat, take your time, and keep going in the same pattern, the same direction. Make sure you have enough thread, because I did have to stop about halfway through there. I did that simply because I didn't want 76 inches of thread kind of getting tangled as I go along. Sometimes that happens. You just make sure that you lock it a couple inches before you're going to run out of thread and start back maybe 2 stitches to lock it together. Okay, well, we've come to the end of this paw pad. We're going to tie it, and hopefully it looks what I want it to look like. Sometimes I do a little extra knot there just to make sure. Alright, well, let's flip it over and take a look. Well, thank you for watching my YouTube video tutorial on how to sew faux fur by hand and how to sew markings or patches into your bodysuit. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment. If you follow me on Twitter, you can ask me a question there. I hope you enjoyed my video and watch again.